Welcome, dear listener. Find a comfortable place, settle in, and allow the pace of the world around you to slow. Tonight, we will take a quiet journey into the past. Our focus will be on Anna of Austria, a young girl whose life was shaped not by her own desires, but by the forces of dynasties, politics, and traditions far older than herself. Born into one of the most powerful families of Europe, Anna's fate was written almost before she could speak. At just 14 years of age, she was married, not to a distant stranger, but to her own uncle, in an arrangement that was meant to bind kingdoms together. Her story is not one of great conquests or legendary battles. Instead, it is a story of daily rhythms, family entanglements, and the quiet struggles of a life lived within the golden but confining walls of royalty. As you listen, imagine yourself drifting gently through the corridors of her world. The past, in all its richness, becomes a soft backdrop for your thoughts. If your mind wanders, that is perfectly fine. This story is here to soothe you, not to demand your attention. So let us begin, slowly, by immersing ourselves in the world that surrounded Anna. The sights, the sounds, the smells, and the textures of everyday life in 16th century Europe. Imagine yourself in the mid-16th century, in the heart of the Habsburg domains. The castles and palaces of the dynasty were vast and ornate, yet also cold, their stone walls holding the chill of European winters. Heavy tapestries, woven with images of hunts, saints, or scenes of royal triumph, hung across the walls, not only to display wealth but to block drafts of cold air. The faint aroma of beeswax candles mingled with the smokiness of hearth fires, a constant scent of noble households. The day would begin early. In the gray light of morning, servants moved softly through the corridors. Their footsteps echoed on stone floors, carrying bundles of kindling to start new fires, or carrying ewers of water for washing. For royalty, even the most basic aspects of daily life, rising from bed, dressing, eating, were surrounded by ritual. Anna, like other princesses of her time, would be awakened not by her own will, but at the careful direction of attendants. She was a child, yet she was also a symbol of dynastic continuity. Her chamber was not one of solitude. Ladies-in-waiting would be there, helping her dress in layers of linen, silks, and sometimes velvet, depending on the season. The rustle of fabric was a constant sound in her mornings. Gowns were not simple to put on. They required ties, hooks, and sometimes assistance from several hands. Under her outer garments, Anna would wear a linen chemise, cool against the skin, followed by stays or bodices to shape her figure into the rigid style demanded by court. Then would come the skirts, wide and heavy, their fabric often imported from Italy or Flanders. As she was dressed, prayers might be softly recited. Religion infused the lives of the Habsburgs. The day's rhythm was marked by the ringing of chapel bells, calling not only priests but also the household into awareness of the divine order. For Anna, mornings would begin with devotion before they moved toward lessons, meals, or formal audiences. Breakfast was modest compared to modern expectations. A cup of watered wine, perhaps spiced with herbs, a piece of bread, maybe accompanied by cheese or preserved fruit. Large meals were reserved for later in the day. The air in the great hall would carry the earthy smell of rye loaves, the tang of sharp cheese, and the sweetness of honey, all mingled with the faint odor of rushes strewn across the floor. Beyond the walls of the palace, life moved at a different rhythm. The people who farmed the land, who provided the grain and the meat for the royal kitchens, rose with the sun and labored until dusk. Their days were filled with toil, tilling soil, tending to animals, and repairing tools, yet these rhythms sustained the entire noble household. For Anna, these peasants were distant and largely unseen, but their presence was always felt in the abundance, or scarcity, of food and wealth. Education filled much of her day. Noble girls were not taught the practical skills of managing a farm or shop. Instead, they learned languages, Latin, Spanish, French, Italian, languages of diplomacy. They learned to play instruments, to sing in harmony, and to embroider intricate patterns into cloth. Needlework was more than decoration. It was a form of meditation, hours spent repeating small, careful stitches, creating patterns of order in a world that often lacked it. For Anna, This quiet, repetitive labor may have been one of the few times when she could simply focus inward, her mind wandering like a soft current of a river. Afternoons brought more ceremony. Meals were not simply meals, but displays of hierarchy. Where one sat at the table mattered. The placement of silverware, the sequence of dishes, all carried symbolic weight. For a young girl, this world could be bewildering, a constant reminder that even within family, power shaped every interaction. Evenings in the palace carried their own atmosphere. Candlelight flickered across polished wood and gleaming silver. The rooms would be warmer, filled with voices, sometimes soft, sometimes stern. Music was often present, lutes, viols, and voices raised in hymns or in courtly songs. For Anna, bedtime did not mean privacy. A noble child often slept in a chamber attended by others, her every movement observed, her solitude carefully limited. And yet, within all this formality, there were still moments of softness. The sound of a lullaby sung by a nursemaid, the warmth of a small fire, the comfort of familiar prayers whispered before sleep. For all the grandeur, Anna was still a child, living in a world that expected her to be far older than her years. This was the rhythm of her daily life. A rhythm of rituals, of duties, of constant observation. A life where even simple acts were layered with meaning. As we move deeper into her story, we begin to see how this carefully structured daily life prepared her, or perhaps constrained her, for the moment when she would be drawn into one of the most unusual and controversial marriages of her age. The rhythms of Anna's daily life, gentle as they might seem, were in truth preparations for a destiny she could not choose. To be a Habsburg princess was to be both treasured and restricted. She was valued not simply for herself, but for the alliances her marriage could secure. And in the mid-16th century, alliances meant survival for dynasties. Anna of Austria was born in 1549, the daughter of Maximilian II, Holy Roman Emperor, and Maria of Spain. From the moment of her birth, her future was spoken of not in terms of what she might become, but in terms of whom she might marry. The Habsburg dynasty was vast and powerful, but it was also intensely interwoven. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, all in the hope of preserving power, wealth, and the purity of their royal line. From an early age, Anna was taught to expect that her life was not her own. Even as she practiced her embroidery or repeated her Latin exercises, decisions were being made in distant chambers, where men debated her fate. To be a daughter of the emperor was to be a piece on a board, a piece that could be moved, traded, and bound to another family when the time was right. That time came earlier than anyone might expect. At just 14 years of age, Anna was married to Philip II of Spain. He was not a stranger. He was her uncle, nearly 30 years her senior, and already a man hardened by years of rule, responsibilities, and losses. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, had died young. His second, Mary I of England, the queen known as Bloody Mary, had also passed away, leaving him widowed again. His third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, had died giving birth. And so, for the fourth time, Philip sought a bride. This time, he turned to his own family. His niece, Anna. It is easy, from the perspective of today, to view this arrangement with shock. And indeed, whispers and criticism were present even at the time. Yet, in the logic of the Habsburg dynasty, such marriages were not unusual. They were seen as necessary tools to hold kingdoms together, to bind Spain and Austria in loyalty, to prevent outside powers from gaining influence. Imagine Anna in this moment. 14 years old, still more a child than a woman, suddenly carried from the familiar rhythm of her Austrian household to the formal, heavily ceremonial world of the Spanish court. The journey itself was long and exhausting. She would have traveled by carriage and by ship, passing through landscapes unfamiliar to her young eyes. Mountains gave way to plains, forests to dry, sun-baked fields. The smells changed too, from the sharp pine scents of Central Europe to the dry dust and olive groves of Spain. The wedding took place in 1570. For the dignitaries present, it was a political triumph. For Anna, it was a transformation that would shape the rest of her short life. She was now Queen of Spain, wife to a man she had known since childhood, but never in this way. The ceremony was grand, filled with gold cloth, ringing bells, and solemn vows spoken in Latin. Yet beneath the grandeur was the quiet truth. She was still only 14. Life with Philip II was not one of romance or partnership as we might think of marriage today. Philip was a ruler burdened by endless affairs of state. He was deeply devout, spending long hours in prayer, and he carried a heavy sense of responsibility for his vast empire. For Anna, her role was clear. She was to provide heirs. She was to be obedient, dutiful, and quiet. In time, Anna bore Philip several children. Some lived, others died young, as was so common in that age. The shadow of illness and mortality hung constantly over noble families, no matter their wealth. The survival of children was never assured. Still, Anna fulfilled her duty in the eyes of her family and of Spain. She gave birth to Philip's long-desired male heir, the future Philip III. Despite the strangeness of their union, historical records suggest that Philip held a certain affection for Anna. Unlike some of his earlier marriages, this one carried a sense of gentleness. Perhaps it was her youth, or her quiet demeanor, or perhaps simply the relief of finally having stability in his household. Anna was known to be pious, obedient, and devoted, qualities that suited the expectations of a Spanish queen. Yet, Anna's life was not long. In 1580, just 10 years after her marriage, she fell ill. The court physicians could do little. Illness in the 16th century was poorly understood, and despite the finest care available, Anna's health declined. She died at the age of just 30, leaving behind children who would carry her bloodline into the next generation of rulers. When we reflect on Anna's life, the central image is that of a young girl placed into a role she could not refuse. Her marriage at 14 was not a love story, nor even a tragedy in the dramatic sense. It was, rather, the quiet, steady unfolding of dynastic necessity. She lived within the expectations of her time, never breaking free, yet leaving behind a legacy in the form of her children and the continuation of the Habsburg line. Her story reminds us that royalty, so often imagined as a life of freedom and grandeur, was in truth a life of constraint and duty. Anna's crown was heavy, even for a girl too young to carry it. And yet, her life was more than a single event. Beyond the marriage, beyond the political calculations, there are still mysteries and cultural echoes worth exploring. In our next segment, we will step away from Anna's personal biography and look instead at the larger questions: the mystery and culture of dynastic marriages, the reasons behind such close unions, and the consequences, both visible and hidden, that followed from them. As Anna's life shows us, the marriages of the Habsburgs were not guided by affection, but by strategy. To modern eyes, the idea of a girl marrying her uncle seems almost unthinkable, but to the rulers of 16th century Europe, it was seen as a practical necessity. In this segment, we will step back from Anna's personal story and look at the broader cultural mystery of these unions, why they happened, how they were justified, and what hidden consequences they left behind. Imagine the vast map of Europe during this time. Borders were not fixed lines, but shifting frontiers. Alliances could crumble with a single death, and wars could spring up from dynasties competing for inheritance. For the Habsburgs, the solution was simple: keep power within the family. By marrying cousins, nieces, or uncles, they bound their lands together without handing influence to rival families. To them, these marriages were less about the couple themselves and more about the empire as a whole. The practice was also supported by religion, though in a careful and complicated way. The Catholic Church usually forbade marriages between close relatives, yet dispensations could be granted by the Pope. And for a family as powerful as the Habsburgs, the Church was willing to allow exceptions. The reasoning was that, if such a union secured peace between kingdoms or reinforced Catholic strength, it could be permitted as a special case. Thus, what was forbidden for most became possible for the few who held crowns. But beneath the surface of these arrangements lay hidden costs. Generations of close intermarriage began to concentrate not only wealth and power, but also genes. Over time, physical traits became more pronounced, most famously the so-called Habsburg jaw, a distinct protrusion of the lower lip and chin. This feature is visible in portraits across centuries, painted by court artists who sometimes softened the reality, but could not entirely disguise it. Historians and geneticists today look back and see the quiet consequences of these unions. High rates of infant mortality, fragile health, and infertility became patterns in the Habsburg dynasty. Philip II himself, Anna's husband and uncle, had children who struggled with frailty. And in later generations, the problem became even more severe. Charles II of Spain, Anna's great-grandson, was born with severe physical and mental disabilities, the direct result of too many generations of intermarriage. By the time he died in 1700, the Spanish Habsburg line itself came to an end, leaving Europe to fight over his inheritance. For those living in Anna's time, however, these consequences were not fully understood. Illness was seen as God's will, or the result of sin, or simply the natural uncertainty of life. Few would have connected it to marriage practices, and fewer still would have dared to question the choices of the ruling family. In the quiet rhythm of the court, the daily life of the royals seemed eternal, even if the seeds of decline were quietly sown within their own households. Yet, beyond health, these marriages carried cultural meaning. They reinforced the sense that royalty was separate from ordinary people. To marry within the family was, in a way, to emphasize that rulers were of a different order, bound not by the same social norms as their subjects, but by divine right and necessity. The court chroniclers, the painters, the priests, all reinforced the idea that such unions were not strange, but ordained, proper, and natural within the unique world of dynastic politics. Still, whispers of unease existed. In taverns and marketplaces, common people sometimes mocked the peculiar appearance of their rulers. Rumors passed about why so many royal children died young, or why some seemed weak or strange. These murmurs rarely reached the ears of kings and queens, shielded as they were by ceremony and reverence. But the unease lingered, forming part of the cultural mystery of the Habsburgs, a dynasty so powerful, yet so fragile beneath the surface. When we look at portraits of Anna today, we see not only the image of a young queen, dressed in silk and adorned with jewels, but also the reflection of these larger questions. What did it mean to live in a world where family was both comfort and trap? Where the very people meant to nurture and protect were also the ones who dictated marriages that could weaken the bloodline? The mystery of dynastic unions is not one of hidden treasures or lost ruins, but of the invisible threads that connect power, culture, and biology. It is the mystery of how choices made for empire could shape the very bodies of those who carried crowns. As we move gently forward, let us leave behind this quiet reflection on culture and consequence, and turn instead to the contrasts of social life. For while Anna and her family lived within gilded chambers, bound by ceremony and destiny, others in her world lived in entirely different rhythms: peasants, merchants, and nobles of lesser rank, whose lives unfolded in stark contrast to those of a queen married at 14. As Anna of Austria grew into her role as Queen of Spain, her days unfolded within palaces and chapels, among courtiers and attendants. Her life, shaped by ritual and politics, was not one of freedom but of constant observation. Yet beyond the high stone walls of her world, most of her subjects lived lives utterly different, marked not by diplomacy and dynastic duty, but by the steady demands of survival. Let us pause for a moment and imagine the contrast. Inside the palace, Anna's meals were carefully prepared, arranged on silver plates, and served in order of rank and ritual. Outside, the peasants of Castile and Aragon ate more humbly: bread made from rye or barley, stews of beans and onions, the occasional piece of salted pork or cheese when fortune allowed. The rich scent of roasting meat, so common in royal kitchens, was a rare luxury for most households. Instead, the daily smell of life for ordinary people was of earth, of smoke from hearth fires, and of the animals that lived close by. While Anna's gowns were of velvet, silk, and fine lace, the clothing of the common folk was simple and functional. Wool was most common, coarse and heavy, dyed in muted shades of brown or gray. Women tied their hair back with simple cloth, and men wore rough shoes made from leather, often patched again and again. Each thread, each patch, reflected necessity, not display. For Anna, clothing was ceremony; for her subjects, it was survival. The rhythm of the day also carried great contrasts. Anna's hours were marked by the tolling of chapel bells, lessons in language or music, or the solemn ceremonies of court. For peasants, the rhythm was that of the sun. At dawn, the fields called. Plows cut through the soil, the creak of wooden carts echoed on dirt paths, and hands grew calloused from endless labor. While Anna might practice embroidery, creating careful patterns on silk, her subjects wove baskets, mended nets, or spun wool, work not of refinement, but of absolute need. Illness, too, was different. For Anna, physicians attended her, prescribing exotic remedies, herbs from distant lands, powders of ground pearls, draughts of wine laced with spice. For common people, illness was faced with simple herbal poultices, charms, and prayers. Both rich and poor were vulnerable, but the poor had far fewer defenses. Infant mortality was common across all classes, yet among peasants, entire families could be struck by plague or famine, their losses quiet and unnoticed beyond the village. And yet, in some ways, the lives of ordinary people carried freedoms unknown to Anna. A farmer's daughter might choose her husband from within her village, guided by affection as much as practicality. A merchant might dream of profit and upward movement. Even within hardship, there was a certain latitude in choice. For Anna, choice was almost entirely absent. Every friend, every duty, every movement of her life was determined by her birth and her crown. The elites, of course, lived in a world closer to Anna's. Lesser nobles, courtiers, and officials at the Spanish court mirrored her rituals, each vying for position and favor. But their lives, too, were precarious. A noble who fell out of the king's favor could lose lands and titles. A courtier who angered the wrong official could find himself exiled. In such a world, appearances mattered deeply. A misplaced word, a wrongly chosen ally, could undo an entire family. For the merchants of Spain, life was shaped by the empire's vast trade. Ships brought silver from the Americas, spices from Asia, and fabrics from across Europe. Markets bustled with goods, the sound of haggling, the clatter of carts, and the voices of buyers calling out prices. For them, Spain was not just a homeland, but the center of a global web of exchange. Anna, in her palace, might wear silk from China or jewels from Peru, but for the merchants, these goods were livelihoods. And for the peasants, who made up the majority, the empire was a distant shadow. The decisions of kings and queens mattered little to their daily lives. What mattered was whether the harvest came in, whether the winter was harsh, whether disease passed through their village. The lives of peasants were filled with labor, but also with small comforts, songs sung at festivals, stories told by firelight, prayers whispered in chapels that smelled of candle wax and damp stone. This contrast, between the gilded halls of Anna's world and the simple cottages of her subjects, offers us a quiet reflection. Royalty, for all its splendor, often lived in greater confinement than those who tilled the earth. The crown was a symbol of power, but also a chain. A peasant girl might dream of freedom beyond her village, while Anna could only dream within her palace walls. As the day faded in both palace and village alike, candles flickered in the chambers of royalty, and hearth fires glowed in the cottages of peasants. Across the vast empire, from Spain to Austria, people laid down to rest, queens and farmers alike. The rhythms of life were so different, and yet in sleep, all found the same stillness. With Anna's story and her world now set before us, we move into a gentle conclusion. We will reflect not only on her life, but on what it tells us about the nature of power, duty, and the quiet comforts of the present moment compared to the burdens of the past. And so, dear listener, we reach the end of our quiet journey through the life of Anna of Austria. From her early days in the ordered rhythms of a Habsburg household, to her sudden transition into marriage at only 14, Anna's life was one of constraint and duty. She became a queen, not by choice, but by the will of her family and the logic of dynastic power. She bore children, one of whom would become king, and she lived quietly, dutifully, within the solemn world of the Spanish court. Her story ended too soon, at the age of 30, leaving behind both heirs and questions about the cost of such tightly bound dynasties. Her life reminds us that royalty, often imagined as a world of ease and grandeur, could be as difficult as the lives of common folk, difficult not for lack of food or shelter, but for lack of freedom. Every gesture, every marriage, every moment was chosen for her. To wear the crown was not to be free, but to be bound by centuries of expectation. And yet, in Anna's story, there is also something quietly universal. The rhythm of her days, marked by morning prayers, lessons, meals, and candlelight evenings, mirrors the rhythms of ordinary life, though clothed in different forms. The peasants in their fields, the merchants in their markets, the nobles in their courts, all moved through cycles of work and rest, hope and loss, duty and desire. In the end, they all sought comfort, security, and the gentle relief of sleep. Now, as you rest in the present, you can reflect on how far the world has come. No longer are marriages arranged to secure empires. No longer must 14-year-old girls be bound to uncles or kings. We live in a time where choices are broader, and where comforts, warmth, medicine, freedom, are taken for granted in ways Anna could never have imagined. Think, for a moment, of the quiet around you now. The stillness of your own room, the softness of your bed, the calm rhythm of your breathing. Compared to the heavy walls of palaces, compared to the weight of crowns, your world is one of gentleness. Anna never knew such peace, but you can allow it to be yours. As the past drifts gently into silence, so too can your thoughts. Let them wander where they will, as softly as candle smoke fading into the night. Whether you reflect on Anna, on the peasants who worked the land, or on the mysteries of dynasties long gone, let those images become lighter, hazier, like dreams dissolving at dawn. You may allow yourself, now, to let go of the story. The world of the 16th century recedes, its sounds and scents fading into the distance. All that remains is calm. Rest, then, with the knowledge that history holds countless lives, each with their own struggles and rhythms. Anna's story is but one among many, a quiet reminder of how deeply the past can shape the present. And with that thought, let the weight of the day lift gently away. May your mind find stillness, your body find comfort, and your spirit drift into peaceful sleep. Good night.